Last week we talked about, we looked at capitalism. We asked the question, what is it? And we looked at that from a historical and analytical perspective, and talked about what it is and what it is not, which is as important to how we define capitalism. And tonight we're continuing on a similar line, continuing to ask, what is it? But from a theological perspective, and we're using the New Testament language of the powers as a door that opens a way into that. So apologies for the repetition for those who already heard that little intro before I remembered to record it. We'll move on. This is where we are in the program. It's a 6-part series, and we're on the second one. Next week, we're going to be talking about how the relationship between capitalism and Christianity, and particularly the disturbing fact that capitalism arose out of Christian Europe and what we make of that. Tonight, we're going to dwell upon the what is it question from a theological perspective. Just to briefly recap on some things that we talked about last week. And I think it's important to do this for what we're going to talk about tonight, but also because some of the ways I talked about capitalism last week are a little bit counterintuitive. I think I'm probably going to it's helpful to just repeat some of them, and maybe repeating them through this series just to help bed them down, because there are some common confusions that we need to overcome. So when we're talking about what is capitalism, let's start with tonight what it is, what we do not mean. So last week I mentioned that there's actually no settled definition for the term capitalism, and different people have meant different things by it. So I'm making clear how I'm using what's called a world systems theory definition of capitalism, and so we can make clear what we're not talking about when we're talking about capitalism. And primarily, we're not using capitalism merely as a synonym for these things. We're not using it just as a synonym for commerce or for business or trade or for profit making. We have perfectly good words for these things, and there's no need to complicate the issue by coming up with a word capitalism. These things are things in their own right. Likewise, a market economy, we have a perfectly good term to refer to such a thing. So when we're talking about capitalism, we don't simply mean a market economy. We're talking about something else. Probably more pointedly, so Karl Marx tended to think of capitalism as a mode of production, by which he basically meant industrialization and industrial wage labor. So we're rejecting Marx's definition of capitalism in this, how we're talking about capitalism. We're saying it's more than just a mode of production as well. And neither is capitalism simply a free market economic ideology. And many people these days use the term neoliberalism. So capitalism is not even an ideology at all. There are ideologies that are used to justify capitalism, such as neoliberalism, but those are different from capitalism itself. So we're not using capitalism to mean any of market systems which are not capitalist. And the standout one, of course, is Imperial China in the 13th to 18th centuries. So Imperial China at this time was hands down the world's largest, wealthiest, most integrated and most technologically sophisticated market economy, well above where Europe was at the time. It's been described by some economic historians as a pro-market and anti-capitalist economic system. So that's just a good historical example of what I was saying in theory there. So what is capitalism? Well, first and foremost, we're just using capitalism, recognizing that it is a historiographical construct. That's just a fancy word for saying, a way of saying, it's a way of naming something that we can see happening in history. So although capitalism comes to us as a noun, it's really doing the work of an adjective. It's describing something that we can see. And history, it's over a big course of history, and it's trying to capture something that's being observed. So that's the first thing it's doing. It's naming something we see in history. Secondly, it's describing, we could use the term capitalism to describe the behavior of individuals. We could use it to describe the behavior of firms and companies and corporations, and we can even use it to describe the behavior of some nations as well. But I have argued, and others have argued, that it really comes into its own when we use it as a term to describe the behavior of an economic system, or what I'm going to call a world system. So what is a capitalist world system? What does it look like? It's an economic system that is defined by these two fundamental aspects. It's defined by the process of endless accumulation, so that this is different from the way other economic systems have behaved, I've argued, and it's also defined by the process of relentless commodification, which is the means to endless accumulation. So relentless commodification describes the processes by which more and more elements of life, whether they be elements of human society or even ecology, are brought into the processes of the market such that they can be bought and sold for a profit. That's what commodification describes. So capitalism is an economic system that is defined by the centrality of those two things. We've also talked about it as a world system, and this is a technical term. So in this context, a world system doesn't mean covering the whole globe. It means a system that's a world unto itself. So a world system is a large integrated economic unit that is largely self-contained. So in the image below, you can see a map of the world systems that existed in the 13th century. This is by one definition. So a series of world systems, they overlapped, but they are basically units unto themselves. We're going to focus our attention to the world system, the little circle that's on the far left-hand corner of that map in Western Europe. And so all of those world systems I mentioned in the 13th century were basically commercial world systems, but in the 13th century, none of them were capitalist. So what we're interested in is how that little world system up in the top left-hand corner, which was the least important of them all at the time, turned into a capitalist world system. And in world systems theory, that's generally understood to have happened, the transition to capitalism, roughly between 1450 to 1650. There's different ways you can talk about the dating of it, but that's as good as any. And I won't go into the details of how that happened. So we talked about a whole perfect storm of events that coalesced in Europe to bring that about. It wasn't designed, no one created it, no one thought of it. It just happened, really, you might say, by a series of historical accidents. But once it was born and created and generating as a self-sustaining system, the European world system, which was capitalist, expanded inexorably until by the mid-19th century, it had displaced all other world systems. So all those other loops you saw in that map previously were swallowed up within the European capitalist system, which is rapidly becoming a global capitalist system. In fact, the first global world system in human history, such that to this day now, we live in a capitalist world system that is the only game in town. There are no other world systems in existence. So what have been the characteristics of this capitalist world economy or world system? I've said this in a different way, but it's right at its heart, it's driven by and defined by a competitive growth dynamic. The system has a system need. So all systems, there's all sorts of systems we could describe out there in the world. There are climate systems, there are ecological systems, there are social systems. They all have different behaviors, things they need to do to maintain themselves as a system. In the capitalist system, what it needs to do to maintain itself as a system is to grow. If it doesn't grow, it begins to face crises. And that has happened at periodic times in the system's life, but it's managed to overcome those at each point. It has to grow, and to do that, it always seeks to expand. So that's to expand geographically, but also to so it's broadening the geographic reach of its processes, but it also does it by intensification, which means capitalism continually is sending its roots deeper and further down into the various areas of human society and ecology, as I said before, to bring those into the processes of the market. Secondly, the other thing that's defined this world system is that it has, since its inception, it's always taken place within a competitive interstate system, so an international system. So it has never just happened in one state. It's never been controlled by just one state, but it's always happened as a system that's happened between states who are in competition with one another. So it's the competition of states that's driving this thing as much as the competition of other, we might call them capitalist actors acting within the system. The rise of capitalism has taken place alongside the rise of the modern state, how we think about states in their modern sense. They have co-evolved together and they are codependent. They're not the same thing, but they have arisen together, and they've been they've each, neither of them has a history without the other being present. Contrary to Karl Marx, capitalism, its home ground is really finance, not production, not the world of industry. It's the higher realm of abstract money. A capitalist world system, in whatever form it takes, has always worked towards a vertical integration of different geographic regions. So some regions become very affluent and others tend to have the wealth drained for them, and some regions seem to operate somewhere in the middle between those. Whether that's done that on a small scale within countries or on a world scale, that's something capitalism always does. So now I'm going to talk about the characteristics of the capitalist basically say a similar thing, but pointing to some different things. I'm going to talk about the characteristics of this world system in a different way. So I've already said that it's defined by the process of endless accumulation and relentless commodification. It's defined by, I talked about an interstate system, a competitive interstate system. What that means, the capitalist world system has become a system of ungoverned governance. That it's something that tends to govern, to use that term, the behavior of individuals and the behavior of firms and companies and the behavior of states even, but it is itself governed by no one and ungovernable. So it's ungoverned governance. This world system is characterized by what I've called the great inversion. And I'm drawing on Karl Polanyi's term of that instead of the economy being embedded in social relations, which has been the case for all other world systems in human history. That's a big statement to say. So all other world systems in human history have been ones in which the economy has been embedded in social relations. But in a capitalist world system, social relations have become embedded within the economic system. In the capitalist world system, we have this dialectic between capitalism and the state. So I'm saying that similar to what I said before, but in a different way. So we have this tension between the two. So they are codependent, but they are also each other's largest threat. The largest threat to capitalism is the state, because of the power that states have and what they can do to clip the wings of capitalism. And likewise, capitalism is the largest threat to the state. It's the thing that can most undermine its processes and its authority. We also see within capitalism a dialectic between the capitalist world system and markets. So on the one hand, the capitalist world, capitalism needs markets. It's the mechanism it uses to do all its stuff. And yet, over the long run, capitalism tends to undermine markets and ultimately tends to anti-market behavior. It's a contradiction at the heart of the system that we see played out again and again. We can see it happening in our own times. The capitalist world system has always been characterized by the polarization of reward, which basically means that whether we're talking socially or geographically, we're always seeing growing inequality and concentration of wealth happening within a capitalist system. It's characterized, all its processes, by, I've said it has to grow, but the way that what we mean by grow, what is growing, is actually something which is an entirely abstract thing, which in one sense doesn't exist. It's a number that's denominated by that symbol you see there, the dollar sign. And well, it could be euros or pounds, but basically money, which is an abstract thing. We're going to talk a bit about the meaning of that a bit more tonight and how significant that is. And the capitalist world system is also characterized by a metabolic rift. So it's a system that metabolizes nature and metabolizes ecosystems and dissolves them into commodities, into things that can be bought and traded in world markets. So it has been an incredibly powerful force for reorganizing world ecology. Really important to say, having said all of that, and to remember this through tonight for what we're going to talk about, although it seems like it may be omnipotent and omnipresent, it is not. It is one of the deceits of it. And I'm just remembering a slide I forgot to put in. I'll have to try and remember to mention that later on. So that is an important thought for later on tonight, but it will become very important when we come to particularly our fifth session, where we're talking about Christian witness in the Christian witness in the midst of capitalism, and we can begin to think about the places where there are air pockets within this system where we can think and practice, let's call it non-capitalism. All right, so that's my run through, quick take on what it is that we're talking about. I better get into tonight's topic now, is to think about what the meaning of that theologically is and what language the New Testament gives us to help think about that. So here, I'm just to drill that data down to a couple very basic points. So we talked about as capitalism as the system of the world. And as such, we're talking about it as an impersonal force that seems to govern our lives and seems to govern the world. That's on one hand. But on the other hand, and I haven't said as much about this, capitalism also comes to us as a worldview, or a way of seeing and imagining the world. Last week, I briefly talked about Max Weber's, the way he defined capitalism, which was as a form of rationality, as a way of apprehending and thinking about the world. And so it's certainly that as well. So there's the famous quote from Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, which says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, or it seems that way. And that's a demonstration of the grip it seems to have on our minds. So this is what we're confronted with, is this system of the world. So how does that relate to this little statement that we find come up in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, where Paul in the beginning of chapter 2 of that letter says this: "You were dead through the trespasses and sins in which you once lived, following the course of this world, following the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work among those who are disobedient. Now, I don't know if you've come across this part of Ephesians. I'm sure many of you have. Paul's saying something fascinating and amazing in this statement. He seems to be saying that there is a spirit that seems to rule the world in some way, and its power is so pervasive. It's something like the power of the air, and that he's reminding the Ephesians, the church in Ephesus, that they were once enslaved to this power, and now they're not, which is the other significant part of that's past tense. Now they're not. So that's an interesting bit of data. Paul's talking about something that was governing their lives, from which they have been freed, but which seemed all pervasive. Then we get this other statement later on in the letter to the Ephesians, where Paul says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." Whoa, Paul's gone all Spiro on us. And he's talking about stuff which makes us modern people feel very uncomfortable indeed. Talking about world forces and powers and spiritual forces of wickedness. What's he talking about, and how is that of any use to us? So here, of course, we're talking about Paul's language of the principalities and powers. And actually, we find this language not just in Paul, but we find language of the principalities and powers through the Gospels as well, in different forms, but actually it's there too. But it's at its most developed in Paul's letters. Now, at this point, I have to mention, I can't go any further without acknowledging that for many Christians, when they hear the language of the principality and powers, these books are brought to mind. I can't really see any faces on the my Zoom screen, so I can't tell if you're. I don't know. There's some people, at least some nods there, who have read these books by Frank E. Peretti, which came out in the 1980s. This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness, and they're basically these novels in which, at least in one of them, I have to admit I've read them both. Set in some small town in America, and you have the faithful pastor of some struggling local church who's fervently and faithfully in prayer. And what the novel does is strips back the veil for us, and we can see what's happening in the spiritual realm. And next to this little pastor who's praying is an angel standing with a flaming sword fighting off these demons who are coming, and this is happening all through the town. And the books are basically provide, this sort of fantastical view of the spiritual realm, and it's sort of pitched as a manifesto of spiritual warfare, and it really got a lot of people excited and interested in the 1980s in spiritual warfare. Actually, really what it was a very effective dog whistle for the American religious rights. I won't say too much more about that, other than to say, when we're talking about the principalities and powers tonight, it has nothing to do with what Frank E. Peretti was describing. Okay, if you've been influenced by that, or that's the sort of picture you get, you're going to have to somehow evacuate your mind of those images. You're going to have to cast it out, maybe. And we're not talking. Tonight we're going to look at some much more serious theologians than Frank Peretti, and how they've thought about the principalities and powers and this language in the New Testament. We're going to start with John Howard Yoder. This is known as an Anabaptist theologian, probably the preeminent Anabaptist theologian. This is his most famous book, The Politics of Jesus. He did a lot of thinking about the powers, and they were quite central to his work. So for Yoder, when he's talking about the powers in the New Testament, what he thinks of them as a potent and a realistic language for describing the unseen forces that govern human affairs. So how Yoda's not really interested in trying to say what are they actually in any sort of objective or scientific sense. What he sees them is as a really powerful and evocative language for describing the things that we experience as humans. Yoda also notes, and in this, he's basically, there's basically consensus of most New Testament scholars and most theologians who have thought about this, that when the New Testament's talking about earthly rulers and spiritual rulers, they're all bound up together in one field. So unlike us, who want to make very strong and clear distinctions between earthly structures, so parliaments and prime ministers and presidents and reserve banks and things like that, and what we might see as spiritual forces and see them as something else entirely together, if we want to think about them at all, which we mostly don't, except those factions of the church who think about them way too much. So we're very uncomfortable, but in the New Testament world, these things are all bound up together. Don't make clear distinctions about them. So when Paul's talking about the principalities and powers, is he talking about earthly rulers sometimes, or is he talking about spiritual powers, or is he talking about both? And sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, sometimes it's both. And you can only really sort of infer by the context of his writing, but they are all bound up together. Secondly, something Yoda pays attention to is that Paul seems to suggest that the powers are actually created by God, and they serve a providential function in ordering human affairs. That means, by that, he means that they do something that basically continues to protect us in the time of the fall. So in the fall, human sin is let loose in the world, and to prevent humans from destroying themselves, we have these providential things that basically help us not go that far. And so the classic statement in Paul's writing is Romans chapter 12, where he talks about, Romans chapter 13, where Paul talks about political authority as ordained by God to keep order. And it's doing this basic function for us, and we need it. So the powers for Yoda are something that we cannot live without. They serve a providential function. However, the powers are also fallen and have become oppressive to us. So oppressive, in fact, we cannot live with them. So we cannot live without the powers, but neither can we live with them. And Yoda thinks that this contradiction is actually a pretty realistic description of the predicament we find ourselves in. So the state, for example, we need the state to do all sorts of things for us, but it also seems to be right at the heart of the problem in so many ways. I'll just mention this right at, so underpinning all this theology of the powers for Yoda is this ultimate conviction that Jesus Christ, by his cross, resurrection, ascension, and the pouring out of his Spirit, has triumphed over the powers. And this is the concrete meaning of the term Lord. So when we say Jesus is Lord, it's specifically in relation to the powers that it's meant. Now, we're not going to do too much with that statement tonight, but we're going to come back to it, particularly in part 5 when we think about Christian witness.
That's about half an hour now, John.
Okay, I better get my skates on. So let's move on to another serious theologian, Karl Barth, probably the most significant theologian of the 20th century. So serious, in fact, he wrote all these books, most known for his church dogmatics. What a crazy cat. I don't know how anyone could read all those books, let alone write them. Anyway, he was a crazy dude, but he wrote some pretty important stuff. So Barth, when he's thinking about the powers, he uses the term the lordless powers, these powers that no longer have a lord, to describe Paul's language of the New Testament. And he sees the lordless powers as none other than humanity's own powers and abilities, but from which we've become alienated. So the expression of our own powers, abilities, such that they no longer serve us, but they've become our masters instead. So But sort of hedges his bets about what these things actually are. And he says they're pseudo-objective entities, whatever that means, with some kind of existence and dominion of their own. Well, what they really are is that they describe the hidden wire pullers in man's great and small enterprises. Barth is particularly interested in two archetypal types of lordless powers that he's discerned in the writings of the New Testament. And he names these as the myth of the state and mammon. So let's look at each of those in turn. So his archetypal lordless powers. The first is the myth of the state, which he names as Leviathan, drawing on Thomas Hobbes' famous work of political philosophy from the end of the 17th century, which really defined the power of the state as the Leviathan. So for Barth, Leviathan describes not government as such, which we need. Government's a necessary thing, but it describes the power and ideology of the state once it's become once it has exalted itself and broken loose from law. And what Barth particularly has in mind is the modern idea of the sovereign state. So in medieval times, even the most absolutist form of sovereignty, such as that of Louis XIV, King of France, was always attenuated as an absolutism under divine law. But under the social contract theory of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau in the 17th and 18th century, the state, the sovereignty of state, becomes located not in divine law, but in the sovereign will of the people. However, this is how, and it's defined differently by Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, how you come to that, but all locate the sovereignty of the state in the sovereign will of the people. Literally, it has no lord above it. It is a lordless power. It recognizes no other lord. So then there's other lordless power that he's interested, which is mammon. And so for Barth, mammon describes when economic resources, which are good and necessary in themselves, begin to take on their own laws and forces which exert pressure on humanity to submit in obedience. He's really talking here about what we would hear about all the time is the laws of economics. So such that the Reserve Bank tells us it has to raise interest rates, it has to increase the unemployment rate to control inflation. It has no choice, but it's merely responding to the laws of economics. So for Barth, this sort of pressure to obedience takes on its most intensive form in the abstracted form of money, which in itself he sees as, he calls it, an intrinsically harmless but useful fiction, but which in modern times has become the ultimate measure of value in modernity. And we're going to talk more about that later. So Barth comes to the conclusion that the obedience that mammon can command makes it an absolutist demon, not to mention what happens when mammon meets and joins with that other demon, Leviathan. So when we have a fusion of mammon and Leviathan, we have something ominous. So just remember that idea for later. Okay, have a quick look at our third thinker, Jacques Ellul, a French theologian, sociologist, wrote a lot of stuff. This is the book I'm going to draw on tonight, Money and Power. So contrary to Barth, Jacques Ellul never sees that money is never a neutral force. It always has power in our lives. And therefore, we cannot talk meaningfully about capitalism without directing a laser-like focus on money and how we relate to money. So that Ellul points out that we seem to have a very deep-seated belief that money solves our problems. It's something in which we place an ultimate trust. And in actual fact, the Aramaic word mammon, to the best of our knowledge, seems to translate as that in which we trust. So Ellul points that money has both an internal and an external impact upon us. Internally, it seduces us away from God. Externally, it takes on the character of laws and demands that operate beyond the individual, whatever they think, and among people to affect them in different ways, as I've just described with the Reserve Bank making decisions that will affect people irrespective of what they think about money. So money for Elul is a law unto itself in direct opposition to God, and that's why Jesus names it mammon. So it's worth reading this quote in full from Elul. Possession by this power is broadly characterized by the consensus which gives money effective social and political power in every human society. Money has no material force except as people attribute force to it. Money as an object is not the master of states, of armies, of the masses, or of the mind, except by humanity's consent to its authority. It is a strange sort of convention which leads people to attribute by both judgment and by will value to something which in itself has no value of use or of exchange. It's a pretty powerful statement. So for Elul, capitalism is systemic mammonism, if you like. It's the progressive subordination of all of life to the value equations of money. That's what capitalism does. I'm now going a bit extending beyond Elul here and just taking that thought a bit further. So really, one way we can think about capitalism as a theological category is as a subcategory of a bigger category that we're calling mammon. So if we're to talk in the terms of biological taxonomy, mammon would represent the genus, and capitalism is one species of that genus. So in history, we've seen different historic forms of the genus mammon. So this is me, not Elul at this point. So in the Roman Empire, perhaps it's been animated by mammon in one sense, Mammonus Conquesticus. The Vikings were also animated by a form of mammon, Mammonus Lutus, perhaps. And what we're talking about is a different form of mammonism, which is Mammonus accumulatans, perhaps the most rational and progressive form of them all. All right. So Elul goes on and says, we're going to dwell a bit further on this really significant point that money represents nothing. It's what he calls an empty sign. It stands for nothing, it symbolizes nothing, and points to nothing other than itself. So most things we have in the world operate as signs in one way or another. So if I give you a jar of homemade jam, I'm giving you jam, and it's made up of ingredients and so on. But it's also a sign that communicates something more beyond itself. It points to saying something like communicating friendliness or well-wishing to you. It's pointing to something. Here's a very powerful sign. It's a thing in itself, which is a specific thing, but it points to something far bigger than itself. Here is another incredibly powerful sign that almost has no substance in and of itself and points to nothing else other than itself. And yet it's the sign that's used to measure and value almost all other things now on the planet. So most things that exist can be measured by this sign now. Which is incredibly powerful statement. An empty sign. It is the thing that measures the worth of things, and therefore it's the thing that defines worship. And it's for this reason that for Elul, this result makes allegiance to capitalism virtually impossible for a Christian. That's a fairly strong statement. All right, so I'm just about. I'll bring this to a conclusion in a moment. So here's where we're standing with what I've described so far. So we've talked about world systems theory and how that describes capitalism, and we've begun to talk about a theology of the powers and relate that to capitalism. And let's see how they map together. So world system theory, in world system theory, capitalism names something that can be observed in history. In a theology of the powers, capitalism names a spiritual force that can be observed in history. In both cases, what capitalism is doing, what that term is doing, is naming something for us. And that's in itself, a very theological thing to do. In world systems theory, we've talked about capitalism as ungoverned governance, an impersonal force. In the theology of the powers, we've talked about this as this rebellious, lordless power or hidden wire pullers behind human action. In world systems theory, we've talked about capitalism as a colonizing form of rationality, something that tends to take over our imaginations and our minds. Allul talks about capitalism as a seduction of the will. In world systems theory, we've talked about the dialectic of capitalism of the state. What Fernand Braudel talks about, where capitalism only triumphs when it becomes the state. In Barth, he was very worried about the fusion of Leviathan, the myth of the state, and of Mammon. These things, he saw these two things as an ominous thing coming together. And finally, we've talked about in world system theory, capitalism centered on capital, money in its most abstract form in finance. And we've just paid attention to the significance of money as the ultimate arbiter of worth in the world, and related that to the concept of mammon, and ultimately as the quintessence of false worship. So what we've done here is begun to map these two ways of thinking about capitalism, which I think map very well together. They're describing the same thing effectively from different angles and with different languages. What we're also saying is that in world system theory, it describes capitalism as this seemingly world-dominating force that it talks about as unique within human history. And yet within the New Testament, we're noticing that actually the writers of the New Testament are very familiar. They've encountered what they saw as world-dominating forces already in their own world. They had a powerful language for speaking about them and thinking about them, and for how they should then act. So back to this quote then, that's summed up by their conviction that Jesus has triumphed over the powers, and this is the meaning of Jesus is Lord. So when in the fifth section of this series, we come to talk about Christian witness in the midst of capitalism, what we're essentially going to be thinking about in large part is Christian witness in the midst of the powers. We're going to be using what the New Testament has to say about the powers and how we live in their midst in relation to capitalism. And that will become a powerful tool for us to help us think about that. That's my contention, at least. You can see what you think. So I'm going to make this my last slide for the night. I had some others I could talk about, but I think we've run over time. So I'm not going to talk about this, but I think it's worthwhile mentioning. There is also in the New Testament another set of language, which also is a powerful way of describing the things we've talked about. So the language of the principalities and powers is largely found in Paul's letters. In the Johannine literature, that's Gospel of John, the letters of John, and most especially the book of Revelation, we have the more apocalyptic language of Antichrist, the beast, and Babylon. And if you're uncomfortable with language of the powers, many people are even more uncomfortable with this language. But actually, we could, if we had time, we could have great fun doing an exegesis of Revelation and showing that this is also provides a very powerful way of talking about the same sorts of things we've talked about that map quite closely to a world systems theory description of capitalism, and perhaps even more closely than the language of the powers. But we don't have time for that sort of fun tonight. I'm going to finish up there, and let's see what you want to talk about. Okay, over to you, Jacob. How do you want to run this?
Sure. So as before, you can either put your hand up on your little screen and I'll try and catch it, or someone can let me know, or you can send in your question via the chat, or if it's free, you can just ask away, unmute yourself and ask, or you can put your hand up this way and I'll also try and catch it. Maybe while people are thinking, John, we got a question during your talk. It's perhaps more of last week, but just to jog people's memories, what were some of the key events that led to Western Europe moving into capitalism, and how did that spread to the other world systems?
Okay, so some of the things I mentioned were the end of serfdom in the feudal order, and how that meant land and labour became traded. The development of gunpowder warfare, a particularly capital-intensive warfare in what was a particularly fractured political and competitive political. So lots of, to start with, states and cities competing against each other and needing to raise capital to fight. And the success of the North Italian city-states, Venice, Florence, and Genoa, in doing just those things and being commercial, but also investing in gunpowder warfare, and how that was picked up by the emerging nation states, the big territorial states of France, England, the Netherlands, Spain. Those drove things. The new techniques of finance developed, double entry bookkeeping, Arabic numerals played its part in there, things like that. There are a whole bunch of things that happened. The Protestant Reformation also was part of the change of the Renaissance, the changing political ideas of that. All of these things played a part. I wouldn't want to say there was any single cause, but a whole bunch of things came together for between 1450 and 1650 was a period of immense change within Europe. But at the heart of all of that was the competitive interstate system. And that's really what made Europe different from the East Asian and the Indian Ocean systems that we saw. So in East Asia, particularly, China was such a giant amongst all the others. There was no competition in that system. There was a clear leader. You couldn't fight against, except although the Mongols did it once, but basically it just dominated the whole thing. So that was the big difference.
Cool. Any questions for tonight's topic?
Hello, I've got a question.
Great. Go for it, Caleb.
This, I don't even know really how to phrase this, but I'm going to attempt it. But it's about the China example that you gave at the start of a market economy that's not capitalist. And I'm just wondering, my China history is pretty rusty, but if I told someone that that was an example, would they just tell me that people were still very poor in China, and so it's a bad example because, wealthy capitalist Western countries today, I guess, or even the miracle in China or whatever they talk about in economic history, that it's become very wealthy and the millions of people have been lifted out of poverty through their adoption or embracing capitalism. I'm just wondering, is there...
So I think so. One, it's actually just not true so if you were to compare China in, say, the 15th or 16th century, and we're trying to come to some sort of average of, what it for the masses, that's really what we're getting at, really, isn't it? There wasn't a great disparity of wealth, and there probably a sense that in some regions of China, there was probably more affluence, but certainly less disparity in wealth, so a greater equity. So it's not until the standard of living thing where Europe really surpasses the rest of the world happens much later than people think, and it has to do with Europe's the capitalist system that begins to extract resources and wealth from the rest of the world. It's not really until the 19th, different for different parts of Europe, late 18th and 19th century, that Europe starts to, in terms of standards of living, outstrip. But Jacob and I have just recorded a podcast on the Industrial Revolution, which we go into a lot of detail around standards of living there. And actually, for the great masses, in the Industrial Revolution, standard of living go down dramatically for the second time in modern history, actually, for them. So it's not the story that most people think, is probably my main response. It's not really until Europe is really polarizing, what it mean by polarizing the reward, extracting the wealth of the rest of the world, that its own standards of living begin to become noticeably and sustainably higher than everyone else's.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think sort of going into the nuance of those broad strokes and looking at the extractive nature of the growth that paints a bit of depth there. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Caleb.
Ramsey House, you're up next if you want to ask your question, or I can ask it for you. Perhaps I'll ask it for you.
Hello, sorry, I'm a bit unwell. But I was just asking that I've heard in conversation and read in books and literature Matthew 13:12, which reads, "Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they will have will be taken from them." I've heard that used to justify capitalism, and I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts on what Jesus might mean by that, and if that's something you've looked into before?
Yes, I can't think of what the context in Matthew 13 for that is. That same statement appears in Luke 18, or is it 19, where I'm much clearer on the context of that statement, which is in relation to the parable of the pounds. It's in Matthew 13 is not Matthew's parable of the talents. He's separated. Anyway, without going into a long exegesis of either of those things, to make those things a justification for capitalism in either Matthew or Luke, you pretty much have to ignore the rest of the whole gospel, the rest of the gospel of Matthew, or you have to ignore the rest of the gospel of Luke. It just cannot gel with the rest of what Jesus teaches in the gospel. And so that's very clear. That's astoundingly clear in Luke's version, if we had time to do the exegesis on how Jesus uses that term. Matthew, as with Matthew's parable of the talents, is a bit more ambivalent than Luke's parable of the pounds. But even acknowledging that ambivalence, to make it a justification for capitalism, you have to ignore everything else Jesus has said in the Gospel of Matthew, which I just don't think is a good way to read the Gospels. That's a short answer for what would be have to be a longer exegetical answer. Hope that gives you something.
Great. And from Saskia, what was the theology of the Calvinist Protestant Dutch merchants, which may have driven them to behave in the capitalist way they did?
Great question. I'm not going to answer that question because that's our whole subject next week. How was it that we had these very devout Christians become also devout capitalists at the spearhead, which they were at that stage in the Dutch world of the capitalist world system? So great question, Saskia, and we're going to spend next week answering pretty much that question, or having a go at it anyway.
Fantastic. And Clinton, I believe his mic's still not working. He asks, if I understood correctly, Elul was suggesting that money only has power that we give to it. I would have thought that money does have inherently power. Can you please maybe elaborate on this a bit more?
So when he says power that he would, it's a little while since I read the book. I think this is what he would say. Something like, it does have power, real world power, but only by our collective act of giving it that power. And that's a collective act. So it's not an individual act. So it's not just us individually giving it that power in our lives. Because we do it collectively, and it's now forms the law of nations, it literally has that power. So whatever we think about money, it has real world power now, because the law of nations works to the law of money. And as in the example I gave with the Reserve Bank, whatever you decide to believe about money has absolutely zero influence on what the the Reserve Bank is going to do in its next decision on interest rates, and that whatever it decides is going to affect you. So money does have real world power. I think Alou would say something like that, although he was a funny guy and sometimes it's pretty hard to understand. So, you know, I'm just going to put an asterisk on that and say I'm not entirely sure.
Cool. Those are all the questions we have banked. I've got one while people are thinking, which is, John, do you have any theories on why perhaps we don't hear this kind of stuff in church, or this kind of like one-to-one drawing of connections like you have for us tonight, or at least in the churches I've been in?
Oh, sure. I mean, one, I don't think people like talking about capitalism in church. Two, people don't much like talking about spiritual powers in church, except in churches where they talk about them all the time and way too much, perhaps. But they don't talk about capitalism as in relation to spiritual powers. And that's, I mean, so we have generally thought about these things. We've totally spiritualized the spiritual powers, and so as in Frank Peretti. So there, you know, he has angels running around with flaming swords, invisible, but they're there and they're fighting demons, and it's, you know, completely separated from our world in one sense, although influencing things. And we're not used to thinking about the world in which we live and breathe and move as one in which real world, and when we say real world transactions are going, that includes spiritual transactions. Spiritual things are happening in all our interactions, both for good and for ill. And we've, as modern people, we've lost the ways in which the New Testament writers thought about those things, which is all of those things being bound up together. So I think all of that combined, and especially, you know, our aversion to talking about controversial stuff in churches is probably at the heart of that.
Yeah, thanks. Paul Hanson, go for it.
And Naomi, did you also? I think Naomi were you sticking up a finger as well? Yeah. So maybe next. You go, Paul.
All right. I'll just continue on that spiritual powers thing. So you a bit more understanding about how the Paul would have understood it. Is it a spiritual power is like a literal entity, like a demon who's sitting there pulling those wires, or are you thinking a spiritual power is ideas that are, I don't know, if you like, anti-Christ or anti-God type ideas?
Yeah, good question, Paul. And the short answer is we can't really be sure exactly what Paul thought. So he uses the language, and he seems to use it flexibly. So that's one thing we can notice in his text. He can use it to talk about human rulers. He can use it to talk about seemingly about unseen forces. And then he can seem to talk about the both in the same phrase as well. So he blends the two without too much worry about the fact that he's doing that. You know, that fascinating statement in Ephesians 2 makes it very abstract, where he talks about the power of the air, the spirit of the power of the air, which is, you know, well, wow, what's that mean? And really, I mean, it strikes me as a powerful image. It's evocative of something that we sort of just live and breathe and is all around us, and is influencing us somehow. What sort of metaphysics, to use the technical term, he actually believed behind that, I don't think we can really go that far to get into his head. He may well have had, you know, some more developed metaphysical ideas about angels or things and what they were and or not. We don't really know. Naomi.
I was just wondering if you could give us some more, for those of us who are interested, some advice for further reading about the theology of the powers, particularly maybe for those of us who are not quite ready to approach the whole of Bath or.
Well, you're not going to go and buy here the volumes of Church Dogmatics. I'm very disappointed to hear that, Naomi. Okay. Yeah. So look, a good place to start. So Walter Wink, that trilogy, I mentioned, that's been distilled into a single book combined. That's called, I think it's called The Powers That Be, is the single version of where he's basically combined that trilogy. I think that's a useful place to start. To my mind, he's not the best of the thinkers on this, but I think he's useful. He provides a framework. He's an entry point in. I think you could read that John Howard Yoder's The Politics of Jesus is a very accessible book. It's a very easy to read, unlike Barth, who can be quite dense at times. He's profound, but dense, but in the thick way, not the dumb way of dense. So you would find that Politics of Jesus quite easy to read. And so there's one chapter specifically which talks about the powers, and I'm from memory, which I think is quite powerful. So you could have a look at that, or even just get it out if you know somewhere where you could get a copy of it. Would be two good places to start.
Cool. Unless I've missed one, I think we've got open floor again.
John Howard Yoder makes me think of a former PM with pointy ears and a lightsaber. Disciple you will be. Yes. He does. It's very, very weird because John Howard wasn't big on a theology of the powers, in which he's calling capitalism to account. But anyway. All right. So how we look like we're got no more questions. Maybe we don't have to use up all the time. I could finish with a final thought, or what do you think, Jacob? We could just call it time now.
Yeah, I reckon if you've got a thought in mind, people can leave if they're bored.
Yeah, sure. Look, let me just no, I won't quite go. I was going to share my screen again, but the final set of slides, which I didn't show, was the question of, can capitalism be redeemed? Because one of Walter Wink's ideas about the powers is that the powers are created, the powers are fallen, and therefore the powers can also be redeemed, and ultimately will be redeemed. So if we're to take Wink seriously, does that mean capitalism be redeemed? And basically, my answer, we have to do, someone's asked, can I share the slide? Okay, I'll do that. See, here we go. So are you seeing that the right slide there? Is that redeeming the powers? So Walter Wink. Oh, you didn't see that. So I just realized I mentioned that book, those books to you, Naomi, and I hadn't shown them. There's the books I mentioned, but they're now in one volume, The Powers That Be. So Walter Wink talks about the powers created and fallen and can be redeemed. So to ask that, we'd have to ask a bit more closely, is capitalism a created providential structure, as Walter Wink is describing? Is it, was it created, and is it providential? And the short answer is no, because, well, we've just talked about we can trace its history to a particular place, to a particular point in time. It's not there at the beginning of human history for there, and it doesn't seem to be particularly providential either. The sorts of things we can talk about as providential structures, here's two. I'm not saying there's the only two, but two core ones, things we cannot live without. So we've already mentioned, Paul talks about political authority. All human societies that we know of have had some form of authority structure to help govern them and run affairs within them, however that is shaped. And likewise, all forms of human society have had some means of economic exchange by which goods are shared between people and between groups of people, between societies. So these are things that seem to be part of the providential structures by which we live and we're maintained. Capitalism, then, if we were to use that framework, names a rebellious spirit that has come to possess these providential structures, political authority and economic exchange, and it's the thing that we cannot live with. in this instance. So this might seem like pretty abstract theology, counting the number of angels on the head of a pin, but it's actually got real world practical importance. Just bear with me. So what we're saying is that political and economic structures can be redeemed, but under the way I've rendered it, capitalism cannot be redeemed. And that entirely hinges on how I've defined capitalism. If you lapse back into thinking of capitalism as merely a synonym for commerce or a synonym for market economies, then that statement would be untenable. But I've described it as something very different from that. In that case, it's something that must be cast out. And by that, it means if it's a spirit, so I'm using that sort of language, and we're talking about the way it dominates states, the way it dominates markets, and the way it dominates our minds. So what that all comes down to in a real world sense is the practical task of, let's call it discerning the spirits, or what Yoda calls social discernment, that Christians have to do to think about all the different sorts of economic processes that they're confronted with. So a very real world example at the moment, the Senate in the Australian Federal Parliament has a Senate Select Committee that's looking at supermarket prices at the moment. So it's looking at something that we need that serves a social good, retail groceries, and examining how they have become that good has been subverted and distorted by the power of two corporate behemoths, Coles and Woolies in particular. So to put that in theological terms, what they don't know they're doing it, but they're trying to extract or temper the capitalism that has subverted those economic processes, the markets. They're trying to redeem the markets from capitalist forces. I think you'd alarm any of the senators if you told them that's what they're doing. But in a sense, we'll come back to this in the fifth session. That's what I'm suggesting we should do in relation to capitalism. That was a very quick run through. I hope that made sense for you. Not sure if that provoked any questions.
Yeah, I mean, we've still got 4 minutes if anyone's been provoked. Given us enough to think on. Oh, perhaps Paul Hansen.
No, I'm just going to say I don't know that I've fully got my brain around your definition of capitalism, but I'll work on it a bit more from what you've said.
Sure. Yep. As I said, so yes, keep thinking about it as something different from markets and commerce, because I'm suggesting markets and commerce are things that can be redeemed and can serve human goods. And capitalism is the way that they get commerce and markets have become shaped to behave within a certain world system. And that's the thing that we're trying to get rid of, in my view. That the Christian task is, if you like. That's my contention. Naomi says, would you say inequality is core to capitalism? Absolutely core to it. So that's central. So what I talked about is the polarization of reward means wealth is always concentrated towards the top. So historically, that's been, in the history of the capitalist, that's always happened. There have been times when that's been wound back usually through the catastrophes of its own making, whether they be wars or depressions or things like that, have then unwound some of those processes. The other great historical force that has sometimes counteracted that is intervention of states. So particularly in the 20th century, we saw states intervene in big ways to attenuate inequality. And when they choose to do that, we see that they can have big impacts. So it doesn't always go one way, but certainly capitalism's tendency as a system is to push things in that direction unless it's significantly opposed by other forces, whether they be social forces or states.
Okay. So Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century,
yep.
That's your sort of capitalism.
Yes, so he's basically, he's saying something that people have known for ages. It really, in a way, the only new thing that Piketty did was provide a huge amount of economic data to show what people already knew, which is that growth in profits always outstrip growth in wages, and therefore wealth accrues at the top. Yeah, and so I'm not 100% sure on his definition of capitalism, but he's really, I mean, to some extent, he wasn't that interested in defining it, but rather figuring out what was happening in relation to inequality. It's meant that you end up having people who were, in their own self-understanding, devout Christians, at the spearhead of driving this system forward and taking it to conquer the rest of the world, which is what happened. How did that all happen? And is there something wrong with Christianity? Is the question, the disturbing question we have to face. And we'll get into that next week. Thanks, folks. Hope to see you, those who are brave enough, next week. Not next week, in a fortnight for the next installment. Same bat channel, same bat time in a fortnight.